In the late 1100s, in the southern lands called Languedoc, Christian life did not follow one single script. People still heard Mass and honoured saints, but many also listened to travelling holy men and women who taught a different path. Their faith later became known as Cathar. It spread openly because local society allowed it to breathe. Here, belief did not immediately trigger arrest. It created options. Cathar teachers offered a strict, simple Christianity. They condemned greed in the church and rejected parts of Catholic ritual life. They spoke of a battle between spirit and the corrupt world, and they expected followers to live cleanly and avoid oath-taking and violence. Many ordinary families admired that clarity. Some nobles protected them, not always from conviction, but from custom and politics. Tolerance became a shield, and growth followed. So Languedoc developed something rare inside Latin Christendom, a rival Christian culture living in public view. Catholic priests still held authority, yet Cathar leaders also received hospitality. Advice was sought from them, and their blessing marked major moments of life and death. The more this parallel world took shape, the less it looked like a private disagreement. It looked like a competing church, rooted in the same towns the papacy claimed as its own. Rome did not treat the Cathars as a local curiosity for long. Church leaders saw a rival version of Christianity growing in plain sight, and they moved to stop it with words before they used force. Papal legates arrived as official envoys, backed by the authority of the Pope himself. Preachers followed, tasked with correcting belief, restoring obedience, and pulling communities back into the Church's orbit. The plan sounded simple: debate, persuade, convert, but it ran into the reality of Languedoc. Cathar leaders offered a disciplined alternative, and many locals respected them more than visiting churchmen. Some Catholic clergy looked compromised, tied to wealth and privilege, and that weakened every sermon aimed at reform. The legates pressed local lords to act, but protection and politics slowed them down. So the missions failed, and failure changed the meaning of the problem. What started as dissent now looked like defiance, and defiance threatened the Church's control over an entire region. Rome's pressure increased. The legates did more than preach. They demanded commitments, punishments, and clear lines of loyalty. Each refusal raised the stakes. A dispute about faith hardened into a crisis about power. By 1208, Rome treated the problem in Languedoc as more than a bad sermon or a stubborn village. It sent Pierre de Castelnau, a papal legate, an official who carried the Pope's authority, to push harder, to demand obedience, and to pressure local rulers to act. That made him powerful. It also made him exposed. The standoff stopped being only about belief. It turned into a test of who ruled. Pierre moved through the region as an enforcer of policy, not a visitor asking politely. He excommunicated opponents and tried to force decisions from men who had avoided choosing sides. Then, in January 1208, as he travelled near the Rhone, he was attacked and killed. The murderer vanished into the same network of loyalties and protections that had shielded the dissident faith. One death changed the balance. It broke the possibility of a slow settlement. Rome did not treat the killing as a local crime to be investigated and contained. It treated it as an assault on the Church itself. Pierre became a martyr, a dead representative of papal authority whose blood could be used as proof that persuasion had failed. That mattered more than the details of the attack. A murder delivered what years of preaching never did: a clean, moral trigger. It gave the papacy a pretext for holy war. In 1209, Pope Innocent III stopped waiting for persuasion to work. After the killing of his legate, he proclaimed a crusade against the heresy in southern France. That word, crusade, changed everything. It meant the Church treated this as the same kind of holy war once aimed at distant enemies, only now it targeted Christians at home. The Pope offered the rewards that made crusades irresistible. Men who joined received spiritual credit, the promise of forgiveness, and the status of fighting for God. But there was another pull. Southern lands were rich, and local power was fragmented. For northern French nobles, this campaign offered a rare combination, a holy cause that also opened the door to new estates. So armies gathered in the north and moved south under the Church's banner. Knights, lords and soldiers followed preachers who framed the war as cleansing and rescue, not conquest. Yet the incentives pushed in one direction. If victory brought both salvation and property, then restraint became unlikely. What arrived in Languedoc in 1209 was not a debate. It was an invasion with blessings. In the summer of 1209, the crusade moved from promises into action. The army from the north reached Béziers, a busy town with both Cathars and ordinary Catholics inside its walls. The crusaders demanded that the heretics were handed over. The town refused. That refusal turned a religious campaign into a test of force. What followed set the tone for everything that came after. The assault broke loose fast, and control disappeared just as fast. Fighters poured into Béziers, and the violence did not stop at the people the Church had targeted. It spread to everyone. Men, women and children died in large numbers, without trial, without sorting, without mercy. The message landed across the region in one brutal fact. Identity no longer protected you. Not even obedience did. Béziers became the Crusade's first mass terror, and it worked like a weapon. It told other towns what refusal would cost, and it told local lords what the Crusaders were willing to do. This was not persuasion anymore. It was extermination, used as proof of righteousness. The word salvation still appeared in the Crusade's language, but on the ground it meant something simpler. Submit or be erased. After the shock of 1209, the Crusade did not fade. It hardened. A new leader emerged at its centre, Simon de Montfort, a northern French noble who turned a one-season holy war into a methodical takeover. Town by town, he pressed south with sieges that did not just defeat enemies, they trapped entire populations. Each surrender set a pattern. Obey or watch the walls fall. Once a place submitted, the fighting did not end there. It changed shape. Montfort and the Crusader army treated conquered land as property to be reorganized, not simply punished. Castles and estates were confiscated. Local lords were pushed aside or forced into humiliating terms. Garrison forces appeared where neighbours had ruled. The message was simple and permanent. This region now answered to the crusade. This was how the war became occupation. Every siege tightened control, every confiscation paid for the next advance, and every forced submission rewired loyalty through fear and loss. For communities accused of protecting Cathars, mercy came with conditions that stripped away independence. Resistance still flared, but it faced an enemy that stayed. The crusade stopped being a campaign of raids. It became a sustained conquest with borders. The war did not end the problem Rome wanted solved. Even after castles fell and leaders submitted, Cathar belief kept moving through families and villages, quiet but stubborn. So the Church changed tactics. It no longer relied on armies to chase heresy from place to place. It built a permanent machinery to find it. Dominican friars, trained to argue and to judge, took the lead. The hunt for Cathars became a routine. This new Inquisition worked like administration, not a battlefield. Investigators arrived with written authority and stayed long enough to map a community. They summoned people, questioned them under oath, and compared answers for contradictions. They recorded names, dates, meetings, and networks of help. Neighbors became sources. Old friendships became risks. A single accusation forced a person to prove innocence, often by naming others. Fear spread because silence looked like guilt. Punishment followed a scale, and that made it even more effective. Some received penances meant to mark them publicly and keep them under watch. Others lost property or were imprisoned for years, removed from their households and their influence. The most serious cases ended in handover to secular authorities for execution. The message stayed simple. Belief was no longer just an idea the Church disliked. It became a record, a charge, and a sentence. The Crusade did not only break armies, it rewired power. Year after year, local lords who once shielded their towns faced a choice: surrender, lose everything, or be treated as heretics' allies. Land changed hands under Church approval, and the map of authority shifted northward. What began as a campaign against belief ended as a takeover of a region. And with each treaty signed under pressure, Cathars lost another layer of protection. The French crown stepped in and made that shift permanent. Royal officials backed the new order, enforced settlements, and treated Languedoc less like a distant neighbour and more like a possession. The turning point came in 1229, when a major peace imposed terms that dismantled independent resistance and bound the region to royal power. After that, protection was not negotiated locally anymore. It was granted or refused by a state that had every reason to cooperate with the Church. That change hit ordinary people fast. A town could no longer rely on its lord to stall, bargain, or quietly look away. The same system that hunted heresy now stood on top of a new political reality: royal courts, royal penalties, royal confiscations. The Cathars had survived in the cracks between competing powers, and those cracks closed. Once Languedoc became absorbed, the movement stood alone. It faced the Inquisition without patrons, without leverage, and without safe ground. By the 1240s, the remaining Cathar network had shrunk into pockets of fugitives and protectors, and one place carried the weight of a final refuge, the fortified mountain site of Montségur. It held not an army, but people who refused to renounce their faith. Royal forces and church-backed commanders tightened a siege and waited. Food ran out, options narrowed. In March 1244, Montségur fell, and the surrender came with a price. After the capture, the authorities separated those who agreed to return to Catholic obedience from those who held firm. For the committed Cathar believers, the outcome ended in fire. Around 200 were burned in a single mass execution near the fortress. It worked as punishment and as a message. This was what refusal looked like now. The aim was not simply to defeat a movement, but to make it socially impossible to survive in the open again. Montségur did not end the hunt. It accelerated it. In the years that followed, other strongholds and hiding places were broken, including Quéribus in 1255, and the pattern repeated. Arrests, forced confessions, and public burnings meant to warn entire towns. Families learned that sheltering a Cathar could cost everything. Some believers disappeared into remote valleys or crossed borders. Many were erased from records except as names in inquisitors' files, listed, condemned, and removed. In the same valleys and hill towns where the faith had once lived in public, it no longer existed as a community. No sermons carried it, no households passed it on, no local lord protected it as a rival Christianity. What remained was absence, and then traces. Names in trial records, confessions forced onto parchment, the outlines of ruined strongholds on ridgelines. The movement that had challenged the church in plain sight ended as something people visited, not something people practiced. Memory survived, but it survived in pieces controlled by others. The story sat in archives built from interrogations, in lists of the accused, in property transfers that followed arrests and executions. Even the landscape became a kind of evidence. Castles labelled Cathar long after the believers disappeared, villages marketed through a tragedy they did not choose. Curiosity replaced commitment. Visitors arrived for history, not faith, and the region's dissidents turned into a consumable past. That contrast carried the final weight of what had happened. A crusade preached as rescue had functioned as removal, of people, of protection, of language, and of power. The violence did not simply silence a doctrine, it broke the society that had sheltered it. When the Crown absorbed the South and the Inquisition organized fear, the open culture of Chapter 1 did not gradually fade. It was dismantled. What endured was tourism, ruins, and paperwork, proof of a near-total cultural annihilation.